Chapter 4 of the Legion of Lazarus by Edmond Hamilton. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 4. It did not stay lost for long. Shearing was at the controls. The chronometer showed 14 hours and 27 minutes since they left the happy dream. Shearing had spent 8 of those hours in a species of comatose slumber, from which he had roused out practically normal. Now Hurst was heavily asleep in the pneumochair beside him. Shearing punched him. "Wake up." After several more punches, Hurst groaned and opened his eyes. He mumbled a question, and Shearing pointed out the wide, curved port that gave full vision forward and on both sides. "It was a good try," he said, "but I don't think we're going to make it. Look there. No, farther back. See it? Now the other side. And there's one astern." Still sleepy but alarmed, Hurst swung his mental vision around. It was easier than looking. 2 fast, powerful tugs from the happy dream, and Belliver's yacht. He frowned in heavy concentration. "Belliver's aboard. He's got a mighty goose egg on his head. Vernon, too, with his shields up tight. The 3 accurate men and the pilot. His nose is a thing of beauty. Plus crew. 9 in all. 2 men each to the tugs. The other Lazarite, the one I laid out, he's not along." Shearing nodded approvingly. "You're getting good. Now take a glance at our fuel tanks and tell me what you see." Hurst sat up straight, fully awake. "Practically," he said, "nothing. This skiff was meant for short hops only. We've got enough for perhaps another 45 minutes, less if we get too involved. They're faster than we are, so they'll catch up to us, say in about half an hour. We have friends coming." "Friends?" "Certainly. You don't think we let each other down, do you? Not the Brotherhood. But they had to come from a long way off. We can't possibly rendezvous under an hour and a half. Maybe more if—" "I know," said Hurst, "if we all get involved." He looked out the port. In the beginning, following directions from the young woman, whose name he had never thought to ask, he had set a course that plunged him deep into one of the wildest sectors of the belt. He was not a pilot. He could, like most men of his time, handle a simple craft under simple conditions. But these conditions were not simple. The skiff's radar was short range, and it had no automatic deflection reflexes. Hurst had had to fly on ESP, spotting meteor swarms, asteroids, debris of all sorts in this poetically named hellhole, the Path of Minor Worlds, and then figuring out how to get by, through, or over them without a crash. Shearing had relieved him just in time. He glowered at the whirling, glittering mess outside, the dust, the shards and fragments of a shattered world. It merged into mist, and his mind was roving again. Shearing jockeyed the controls. He was flying Esper too. The tugs and Belliver's fast yacht were closing up the gap. The level in the tanks went down, used up not in freefall, but in the constant maneuvering. Hurst swung mentally inboard to check vac suits and equipment in the locker, and then out again. His vision was strong and free. He could look at the sun and see the splendid fires of the corona. He could look at Mars, old and cold and dried up, and at Jupiter, massive and sullen, and totally useless except as an anchor for its family of crazy moons. He could look farther than that. He could look at the stars. In a little while, he thought, he could look at whole galaxies. His heart pounded, and the breath came hot and hard into his lungs. It was a good feeling. It made all that had gone before almost worthwhile. The primal immensities drew him, the black gulfs lit with gold and crimson and peacock-colored flames. He wanted to go farther and farther into— "You're learning too fast," said Shearing dryly. Stick to something small and close and sorted, namely, an asteroid where we can land." "I found one," said Hurst. "There." Shearing followed his mental nudge. "Hell," he said. "Couldn't you have spotted something better? These Valhallas give me the creeps." "The others within reach are too small, or there's no cover. We'll have quite a little time to wait. I take it you would like to be alive when your friends come." Vernon's thought broke in on them abruptly. "You have just one chance of that, and that's to give yourselves up, right now." "Does the socially conscious Mr. Belliver still want to give me that job?" asked Hurst. "I'm warning you," said Vernon. "Your mind is full of hate," said Hurst. "Cleanse it." He shut Vernon out as easily as hanging up a phone. Under stress, his new powers were developing rapidly. He felt a little drunk with them. Shearing said, "Don't get above yourself, boy. You're still a cub, you know." Then he grinned briefly and added, "By the way, thanks." Hurst said, "I owed it to you. And you can thank your lady friend, too. She had a big hand in it." "Christina," said Shearing softly. "Yes." He dropped the skiff sharply in a descending curve toward the asteroid. "Do you think," said Hurst, "you can now tell me what the devil this is all about?" Shearing said, "We've got a starship." Hurst stared. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then, "You've got a starship? But nobody has. People talk of someday reaching other stars, but nobody tried yet. Nobody could try." He broke off, suddenly remembering a dark, lonely ship, and a woman with angry eyes watching it. Even in his astonishment, things began to come clearer to him. "So that's it, a starship. And Belliver wants it?" Shearing nodded. "Well," said Hurst, "go on." "You've already developed some amazing mental capabilities since you came back from beyond the door. You'll find that's only the beginning. The radiation, the exposure, something. The simple act of pseudo-death, perhaps. Anyway, the brain is altered, stepped up, a great deal of its normally unused potential released. You've always been a fair to middling technician. You'll find your rating boosted, eventually to the genius level." The skiff veered wildly as Shearing dodged a whizzing chunk of rock the size of a skyscraper. "That's one reason," he said, "why we wanted to get you before Belliver did. The number of technicians undergoing the Humane Penalty is quite small. We, the Brotherhood, need all of them we can get." "But that wasn't the main reason you wanted me?" pressed Hurst. Shearing looked at him. "No, we wanted you mainly because you were present when MacDonald died. Handled right." He paused. The asteroid was rushing at them, and Belliver's ships were close behind. Hurst was already in a vac suit, all but the helmet. "Take the controls," said Shearing. "As she goes. Don't worry, I'll make the landing." He pulled the vac suit on. "Handled right," he said, "you might be the key to that murder, and to the mystery behind it that the Brotherhood must solve." He took the controls again. They helped each other on with their helmets. The asteroid filled the port, a wild, weird jumble of varicolored rock. "I don't see how," said Hurst, into his helmet mic. "Latent impressions," answered Shearing briefly, and sent the skiff skittering in between two great black monoliths to settle with a jar on a pan of rock as smooth and naked as a ballroom floor. "Make it fast," said Shearing. "They're right on top of us." The skiff, designed as Shearing had said for short hops, could not accommodate the extra weight and bulk of an airlock. You were supposed to land in atmosphere. If you didn't, you just pushed a release button and hung on. The air was exhausted in one whistling swoosh, that took with it everything loose. The moisture in it crystallized instantly, and before this frozen drift had even begun to settle, Hurst and Shearing were on their way. They crossed the rock pan in great swaggering bounds. The gravity was light, the horizon only 20 or so miles away. Literally in his mind's eye, Hurst could see the 3 ships arrowing at them. He opened contact with Vernon, knowing Shearing had done so too. Vernon had been looking for them. "Mr. Belliver still prefers to have you alive," he said. "If you'll wait quietly beside the skiff, we'll take you aboard." Shearing gave him a hard answer. "Very well," said Vernon. "Mr. Belliver wants me to make it clear to you that he doesn't intend for you to get away, so you can interpret that as you please. Be seeing you." He broke contact, knowing that Hurst and Shearing would close him out. From now on, Hurst realized, he would keep track of them the way he and Shearing had kept track of obstructions in the path of flight, by mental sight. The yacht was extremely close. Suddenly, Hurst had a confused glimpse of a hand on a control lever, overlapped by a view of the black-mouthed tubes of the yacht's belly jets. He dived literally into a crack between one of the monoliths and a slab that leaned against its base, dragging Shearing with him. The yacht swept over. Nothing happened. It dropped out of sight, braking for a landing. "Imagination," said Shearing. "You realize a possibility, and you think it so. Tricky, but I don't blame you. The safe side is the best one." Hurst looked out the crack. One of the tugs was coming in to land beside the skiff, while the other one circled. "Now what?" he said. "I suppose we can dodge them for a while, but we can't hide from Vernon." Shearing chuckled. He had got his look of tough competence back. He seemed almost to be enjoying himself. "I told you you were only a cub. How do you suppose we've kept the starship hidden all these years? Watch." In the flick of a second, Hurst went blind and deaf. Then he realized that it was only his mental eyes and ears that were blanked out, as though a curtain had been drawn across them. His physical eyes were still clear and sharp, and when Shearing's voice came over the helmet audio, he heard it without trouble. "This is called the cloak. I suppose you could call it an extension of the shield, though it's more like a force field. It's no bar to physical vision, and it has the one great disadvantage of being opaque both ways to mental energy. But it does act as a deflector. If Vernon follows us now, he'll have to do it the hard way. Stick close by me, so I don't have too wide a spread. And it'll be up to you to lead. I can't do both. Let's go." Hurst had, unconsciously, become so used to his new perceptions that it made him feel dull and helpless to be without them. He led off down one of the smooth rock avenues, going away from the skiff and the tug which had just landed. On either side of the avenue were monoliths, irregularly spaced and of different sizes and heights, but following an apparently orderly plan. The light of the distant sun lay raw and blinding on them, casting shadows as black and sharp-edged as though drawn upon the rock with India ink. You could see faces in the monoliths. You could see mighty outlines, singly and in groups, of gods and beasts and men, in combat, in suppliance, in death and burial. That was why these asteroids were called Valhallas. 26 of them had been found so far, and studied, and still no one could say certainly whether or not the hands of any living beings had fashioned them. They might be actual monuments, defaced by cosmic dust, by collision with the myriad fragments of the belt, by time. They might be one of nature's casual jokes, created by the same agencies. No actual tombs had been found, nor tools, nor definitely identifiable artifacts. But still the feeling persisted, in the airless silence of the avenues, that some passing race had paused and wrought for itself a memorial more enduring than its fame, and then gone on into the great galactic sea, never to return. Hurst had never been on a Valhalla before. He understood why Shearing had not wanted to land, and he wished now that they hadn't. There was something overwhelmingly sad and awesome about these leaning, towering figures of stone, moving forever in their lonely orbit, going nowhere, returning to nowhere. Then he saw the second tug overhead. He forgot his daydreams. "They're going to act as a spotter," he said. Shearing grunted, but did not speak. His whole mind was concentrated on maintaining the cloak. Hurst stopped him still in the pitchy shadow under what might have been a kneeling woman 60 feet high. He watched the tug. It lazed away, circling slowly, and he did not think it had seen them. He could not any longer see the place where they had landed, but he assumed that by now the yacht had looped back and come in, if not there, somewhere close by. They could figure on 9 to 11 men hunting them, depending on whether they left the ships guarded or not. Either way, it was too many. "Listen," he said aloud to Shearing. "Listen, I want to ask you. What you said about latent impressions. You think I might have seen and heard the killer, even though I was unconscious?" "Especially heard. Possible. With your increased power, and ours, impressions received through sense channels but not recognized at the time or remembered later might be recovered." He shook his head. "Don't bother me." "I just wanted to know," said Hurst. He thought of his son, and the 2 daughters he hoped he would never see. He thought of Elena. It was too late to do anything for her, but the others were still living. So was he, and he intended to stay that way, at least until he had done what he set out to do. "Old Belliver was behind that killing, wasn't he? Old Quentin, this one's grandfather." "Yes. Don't bother me." "One more thing. Do we Lazarites live longer than men?" Shearing gave him a curious, brief look. "Yes." The tug was out of sight behind a massive rearing shape that seemed to clutch a broken ship between its paws. Symbolic, perhaps, of space? Who knew? Hurst led Shearing in wild, impala-like leaps across an open space and into a narrow way that twisted, filled with darkness, among the bases of a group that resembled an outlandish procession following a king. "How much longer?" "Humane Penalty first came in 114 years ago, right? After Seitz's method was perfected for saving spacemen. I was one of the first they used it on." "My God," said Hurst. Yet somehow he was not as surprised as he might have been. "I've aged," said Shearing apologetically. "I was only 27 then." They crouched beside a humped shape, like a gigantic lizard with a long tail. The tug swung overhead and slowly on. Hurst said, "Then it's possible the one who killed MacDonald is still alive?" "Possible. Probable." Hurst bared his teeth in what was not at all like a smile. "Good," he said. "That makes me happy." They did not do any talking after that. They had had their helmet radios operating on practically no power at all, so that they couldn't be picked up outside a radius of a few yards, but even that might be too close, now that Belliver's men had had time to get suited and fan out. They shut them off entirely, communicating by yanks and nudges. For what seemed to Hurst like a very long time, but which was probably less than half an hour in measured minutes, they dodged from one patch of shadow to another, following an erratic course that Hurst thought would lead them away from the ships. Once more the tug went over, slow, and then Hurst didn't see it again. The idea that they might have given up occurred to him, but he dismissed it as absurd. With the helmet mic shut off, the silence was beginning to get on his nerves. Once he looked up, and saw a piece of cosmic debris smash into a monolith. Dust and splinters flew, and a great fragment broke off and fell slowly downward, bumping and rebounding, and all of it as soundless as a dream. You couldn't hear yourself walk. You couldn't hear anything but the roar of your own breathing and the pounding of your own blood. The grotesque rocky avenues could hide an army, stealthy, creeping. There was a hill, or at least a higher eminence, crowned with what might have been the cyclopean image of a man stretched out on a noble catafalque, with hooded giants standing by in attitudes of mourning. It seemed like the best place to stop that Hurst had seen, with plenty of cover and a view of the surrounding area. With luck, you might stay hidden there a long time. He jogged Shearing's elbow and pointed, and Shearing nodded. There was a wide, almost circular sweep of open rock around the base of the hill. Hurst looked carefully for the tug. There was no sign of it. He tore out across the open, with Shearing at his heels. The tug swooped over, going fast this time. It could not possibly have missed them. Shearing dropped the cloak with a grunt. "No use for that any more," he said. They bounded up the hillside and in among the mourning figures. The tug whipped around in a tight spiral and hung over the hill. Hurst shook the sweat out of his eyes. His mind was clear again. The tug's skipper was babbling into his communicator, and in another place on the asteroid, Hurst could mentally see a thin skirmish line spread out, and in still another, 4 men in a bunch. They all picked up and began to move toward the hill. Shearing said, nodding spaceward, "Our friends are on the way, if we can hold out." "Fat chance," said Hurst. "They are armed, and all we've got is flare pistols." But he looked around. His eyes detected nothing but rock, hard sunlight, and deep shadow. But his mind saw that one of the black blots at the base of the main block, the catafalque, was more than a shadow. He slid into a crack that resembled a passage, being rounded rather than ragged. Shearing was right behind him. "I don't like this," he said, "but I suppose there's no help for it." The crack led down into a cave or chamber, too irregularly shaped to be artificial, too smoothly surfaced and floored to be natural. There was nothing in it but a block of stone, 9 feet or so long and about 4 feet wide by 5 feet high. It seemed to be a natural part of the floor, but Hurst avoided it. On the opposite, the sunward side, there was a small window-like aperture that admitted a ray of blinding radiance, sharply defined and doing nothing to illumine the dark on either side of it. Vernon's thought came to them, hard, triumphant, peremptory. "Mr. Belliver says you have 10 minutes to come out. After that, no mercy." End of chapter 4.